Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Hi. The Great Antidote is on a break from recording new episodes currently. In the meantime, we've handpicked these episodes for you, so sit back and relax, hop on your bike, or get out your notepad, however you enjoy your podcast. We'll catch you soon for new episodes. Welcome back to my podcast. Today, I'm super excited to talk to Russ Roberts, an economist who has an all too rare ability to explain really complicated issues in uncomplicated language that's easy to understand. He's a research fellow at Hoover Institution, a host of a very popular podcast, Econ Talk, which you've probably heard of, and he's the author of many books, including a few novels. But today, Russ and I are going to talk about his most recent book, which is called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, an unexpected guide to human nature and happiness. That's right. Russ wrote a book about a Scot who was alive several hundred years ago, and he's going to tell us how a great scholar can change your life. Welcome.
Great to be with you, Juliette.
Before we start, I want to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I don't know if I know the answer to that question. Well, I know I don't know the answer, but I will give you some very cheap advice, and you can chew on it, think about it. I think there are a couple things. I'm going to cheat and offer you two pieces of advice. The first is, don't be afraid to fail. A lot of people, I think, just assume that once you've messed up, it's over. You can't get back on your feet. You can't recover. And the great thing about, I think, the modern world is, to a large extent, you can get back on your feet and you can recover. And don't be afraid to fail. Take some chances. And my other piece of advice is related to it, which is I meet a lot of young people who think they have to have a plan, and then they have to execute the plan. I've got to get really good grades, so I go to law school, become a lawyer, make a lot of money, take care of my family, whatever. And, it's okay to not do exactly what you think you're supposed to do. You may not like law school. You may not like being a lawyer. I know a lot of unhappy lawyers. I know some happy ones too. But I think people get a lot of comfort from knowing the plan. And I think there's a value to seeing life as a little more of an adventure, where you find out what you like and don't like along the way. That's true about go to college, what you major in college, what you do in your first job out of college. And I'm going to throw out one more other piece of advice, which is don't take the job that is your first job out of college or grad school. Don't take the job that don't necessarily take the job that pays the most money. It's okay to take the one that pays the most money, but try to take the one where you're going to learn the most. That's going to make your life more interesting. That's going to make your career more interesting. And I think in today's world, people feel like there's a lot of pressure. And chill out. That's my advice.
I think that's really good advice. I mean, especially like now, at least for people like my age specifically, we're all like about to apply to college and have already started, and we're all like so stressed out. So I think kind of a reminder that it's not the end of the world, that like one decision is not going to set you on a trajectory that like you have to do exactly what you think you're going to do now. I think that's really important to remember.
The other related piece of advice to that is that you're afraid, if I don't get into such and such a college, my whole life's ruined. And that's usually not true. And it's usually the data that people use to look at that. Well, people go to this college, make so much more money than people go. Yeah, well, doesn't mean you're going to be like them. And you don't know how much of the gains from going to college or to that particular college are due to who goes there rather than the college itself. So what it means for you is really unclear. I think there's a lot of pressure from parents, which I think is kind of tragic, to get into the most prestigious fanciest college, and there's nothing wrong with going to a less prestigious, less fancy college, or going to community college for a year and save some money. And if you can handle living from home, especially today with the pandemic going. So I just think there's a huge amount of stress on high school juniors and seniors to maximize their SAT score and get into the best school that they can get into, as if their life will be ruined if they don't get into that particular school. And it's really not true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I remember I used to kind of be like that, and then this pandemic hit. I was like, well, it's actually just that I want to learn instead of maximizing my potential future output as a worker or a college student. I just was like, I want to have as much information available to me as I can find. But there are other ways to do that. So
yeah, and
here I am.
Learning's a really good idea. I've remarked on this at Econ Talk many times that I have a son who's majoring in philosophy, and people say, well, what's that good for? And I say, thinking. Thinking seems to me like a good skill to have. So I just think people are also worried that if they don't study, say, business or engineering, their life will be unsuccessful because they don't have a natural place to find that first job. And I just think that's, not true.
I want to ask you how you became the Bastia of modern economics. You did the whole big university research, publishing papers in academic journals, math, concepts only economists understand. And now you write novels, a self-help book about Adam Smith, and you're the co-creator of the incredibly popular rap videos, which illustrate the ideas of Keynes and Hayek, the economists, which had been viewed by more than 7 million people or 7 million times on YouTube. So why do you change gears from academia to a more popular style?
I think it's a combination of things that helped me get to this rather strange career of podcaster, movie maker, novelist, etc. And I taught in the classroom for 30 years in regular economics departments. That was a lot of fun. But now being at the Hoover Institution, the only teaching I do is to the public through these projects that you've kindly mentioned. I was, regular economics is kind of dry, kind of boring. And I had the opportunity to live in we live in a time where there's so many wonderful outlets for creativity, like video, like audio, like writing a novel. And I love getting people excited about economics and the economic way of thinking, and increasingly about philosophy, by using other methods than just sort of the standard journal articles. And, also I don't think I worked hard enough at that academic side. And I found myself enjoying working hard at those other things. So it was kind of an easy choice for me. It's a little bit risky. There were some times when I thought my career might not go so well, but I've been very, very fortunate and blessed to be able to create the things I've been able to create.
I would like to talk briefly about the Keynes versus Hayek videos. Mm-hmm. So there are two of them, rounds 1 and 2. And everyone who's listening, you should go check them out. They're really funny, and the details are very specific, which I really liked. And I feel like I could just listen to them over and over again and learn something new every single time. They're a debate that economists have been having for nearly a century about the way to jumpstart the economy. And Keynes versus Hayek, Keynes is pitted against Hayek, and these are just amazing videos. They're great lessons, and it's cool because it's a rap. So can you talk to us a little bit about those videos?
Sure. So I created those with John Popola, who's a filmmaker who contacted me, a lifetime ago. It feels like it was probably 2009, 2008. He wanted to do a project, and I used to get a lot of people eager to do something like that, creative with me, and that was really fun, except I found that a lot of times people never followed up. It was just hard to do. It's always a fun idea to think about it, dream about it. But he followed up, and we kept trying different ideas. We were going to have a sitcom with Keynes and Hayek rooming together in New York City. Keynes spending a lot of money. Hayek always nervous that they couldn't afford stuff. And then I think at one point I said to John, we're not actually doing anything. We're just talking about doing something. Why don't we write the theme song for the sitcom just for fun? And that sort of got us started. And we decided, I don't know why. I do know why. I was going to say we started writing a rap, which I didn't know much about rap music, still don't. But he and I co-wrote the lyrics and created the beat with some help from others and hired 2 people to deliver them. And John's a great filmmaker, and I got to help with the filmmaking part. And it was just one of the most fun projects I've ever done because, as you said, we tried to make it educational. We tried to make it more than just goofy and funny. It's a little bit goofy and funny, of course, the idea of Keynes and Hayek as rappers. But the other idea was to make the economics really serious. And so we tried to put a ton of economics in there. The first one is the Austrian view of the business cycle versus Keynes's view of the business cycle. And the second one is just about macroeconomics more generally and top-down versus bottom-up ways of making the world a better place. And Keynes is the top-down guy and Hayek's the bottom-up guy. Keynes is about steering things relative to Hayek, and Hayek's more about letting things emerge and take their own organic path. And so, we had it's an incredibly fun time, both writing those with John and then filming them. It was just an amazing experience. And they get used a lot in classrooms, which is gratifying. They've been subtitled in a bunch of languages. So it's a wonderful thing. Incredibly time intensive. So people are always saying, when are you going to do a third one? And John's done a third one. John did one on Mises versus Marx. That's very nice. Using music is always a good idea. I just saw the Hamilton film on Disney, the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical that Disney is showing. And he's got a rap battle in the middle of that between Jefferson and Hamilton. I like to think that he stole it from us, but that probably isn't the case.
Probably not, but maybe. You never know.
I haven't heard from Lynn. I'd love to hear from him. Lynn, if you're listening, give me a shout out. Give me a call.
I don't think he's going to be listening to this one.
You never know. Someone listening could pass it on to him.
That's true. Maybe they will.
Dream big.
Who knows?
Dream big.
So let's dive into Adam Smith.
Yeah.
He was born in 1723, which is almost 300 years ago, like very close to 300 years ago. His influence on economics, trade economics specifically, is remarkable. He's really well known for The Wealth of Nations, but what he's less well known for, or at least nowadays, is his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which inspired your book on how Adam Smith can change your life. I want to first ask you whether you were always a fan of Adam Smith, and if not, how did your relationship with his work evolve over time?
Adam Smith only wrote 2 books total. Of course, they're pretty influential books, so it's not like he was an unproductive scholar. Economics is funny. It's a little bit. Economists like to think of themselves as scientists. I don't think we are, but certainly a modern physicist probably doesn't read a lot of Isaac Newton in graduate school. But in economics, you might, in the old days, meaning when I went to grad school in the 70s, I remember reading a chapter from The Wealth of Nations in labor economics on what are called compensating differentials, the fact that more dangerous jobs pay more than less dangerous jobs, everything else held constant. And so I knew about Adam Smith. I knew he was famous as the so-called father of economics. I knew that he had been a big free trader. I knew he was less interventionist than most economists today. That's all I knew about him. I'd never read The Wealth of Nations in its entirety. And I'd never heard of his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that you mentioned. And so, sometime I think around, 2000 and I forget, maybe 2009 or so, 2010, Dan Klein who was my colleague at the time at George Mason when I was on the faculty there, suggested that we do an Econ Talk episode on the theory of moral sentiments. And I thought, that's a great idea because I've never read it. And I probably should have read this other book. I knew a couple quotes from it that people liked that were well known to people in my circles, but I couldn't have told you anything about what the book was about. I didn't know what the theory of moral sentiments was. So as I say in my book, How Adam Smith Could Change Your Life, I picked up the theory of moral sentiments, thinking I'll just prepare for this interview with Dan Klein, and I can't really understand any of it. I'm really in trouble, and I'm thinking, why did I agree to this? This is embarrassing. And so I put it down, and I picked it up again, and I made some progress, and then I got that kind of the hang of it. But it sort of starts in mid-sentence, midstream, mid-chapter. It's not worded or styled like in a modern book, of course. It's actually not that hard to read once you get the idea of his style and what he's trying to deal with there and trying to answer. And I loved talking to Dan about it. We did a 6-part, it was crazy. We ended up doing a 6-part conversation over more than 6 hours long of talking about, Dan's got a very eclectic take on the book. And I realized that my take on the book wasn't the same as Dan's, which is fine. And we had a nice chat about that over those 6 hours, and then 6+ hours. And then I thought, well, it'd be great to write a book about this because I think this is a masterpiece that most people don't know about. I actually wanted to write a book on Adam Smith and generally, and my agent didn't think that was very exciting. He's not an economist. And so, but at one point I described his, quote, other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, as the greatest self-help book you've never heard of. And he said, that's the book you ought to write. And I thought, I don't really want to write a self-help book. So I like to think of it as a self-help book. I ended up writing it anyway, but I like to think of it as a self-help book for people who don't like self-help books. It's what I'm really trying to do is take Smith's ideas, make them accessible to a modern person and apply them to modern situations. And it was a blast to write, writing that book. It was a lot of fun. And I also like to think, I'm honoring Adam Smith in a way because a lot of people think of him as the greed is good guy. And he didn't believe greed is good. He thought greed was bad. And I write about that a lot in my book because that's a big theme in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. In particular, he doesn't believe you should try to get rich. He thinks that's a mistake. He thinks if you want to be happy, you should earn the respect of the people around you, which is great advice. So I thought it was, I like the idea. I don't know if I've made any dent in this, but I like the idea that people appreciate the real Adam Smith, that he's a slightly richer, maybe he has a slightly more nuanced view of the world than most people thought maybe beforehand. So trying to maybe fix his reputation a little bit.
I think you did a good job with that. I like thinking of it as like a self-help book for people who don't like or think they need self-help type of thing, because I remember I picked it up and I was like, well, I don't know if I need help. I don't like self-help books. I feel like stuff is labeled as self-help books when it's not necessarily like a self-help book. Like I know like Malcolm Gladwell's books are labeled as self-help books, but I don't know if I'd call them self-help books if I was explaining them to someone. But I don't know. For me, it was like help in understanding myself and other people. I don't know. It's a great book, but
thank you
about about how he's misunderstood and how people think that because he's stated that self-interest leads to great things or can lead to great things, that he also favored selfish behaviors or thought that was like, okay. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, or TMS, proves the opposite, as you mentioned. Can you explain like further how he's misunderstood and how TMS kind of shows that?
Yeah, because I think the distinction that you want to keep straight, which is hard to keep straight for some people, is self-interest versus selfish. So we're all self-interested. We all care about ourselves. We often put ourselves first, but that doesn't mean we're selfish just because we're self-interested. And it also doesn't mean we're greedy just because we want enough to take care of our basic desires: food, shelter, clothing, and so on. So what Smith is very clear about in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is that the pursuit of fame, power, and money, and the people who have, let me back up, the people who have fame, power, and money they get a lot of attention in our culture and in Smith's time, which is fun to think about, right? You wouldn't think that fame, power, and money were so important back in 1759 when he first published the first edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. But in his world, there were celebrities. In his world, there were powerful people. And in his world, there were rich people. And they were the ones who got, the attention. When they came into a party, people looked at them. And the way he puts this, beautifully, he says, quote, "Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely." He takes it as a give, end of quote. He takes it as a given that we want to be loved. We want people, and by that he meant people pay attention to us, respect us, honor us, praise us. He takes that as a given, that drives a lot of our pursuits and our desires. But he also says we want to be lovely. We want to earn that praise, earn that respect honestly. And so he says if you're not careful, you're going to be loved by pursuing money and power and fame. And that often will lead you to be not so lovely. You'll do some things maybe that you'll regret later, that your urges and grasping nature may betray you and send you into directions that you will regret. And he says instead you ought to be pursuing wisdom and virtue. That's how the other way to be loved. And I think to be respected, to be honored, to matter. And I think all human beings crave that sense of self-value and that we get from the respect of those around us. And I think that's just a deep insight into what makes us tick.
He also notes that admiration from others needs to be legitimate. It can't be based off of something fake. You can't cheat your way through being loved and appearing to be lovely, right?
Well, you can fool other people sometimes. He discourages you from doing it dishonestly, partly because you'll eventually be found out. But I think more importantly, because if you're self-aware, that you're not genuinely honest or not genuinely lovely, if in fact you are deceiving other people. He actually says in there, one of his stranger statements, I don't think is probably correct, but he says he finds it strange that women wear makeup because it's fake. Right? What's the point of earning a reputation or being attractive if you've earned it through paint, basically, in his day, some kind of paint? And I think that's a little harsh. Adam Smith never married. I don't know. Maybe his understanding of men and women is a little bit different than ours, but you can think of that, even though I think that's a kind of a bizarre thing to say, what he said. I think you can think of that as more as a metaphor. We put on makeup, we put on costumes, we put on armor, we wear various masks to the world. And what Smith's saying is that we'd be better off being more genuine and more authentic and not trying to deceive people about what we aren't, but rather embracing who we are. And that's hard advice to take, but it's really good advice, I believe. And I think it's, the idea that even although we do fool ourselves, he's very aware of that. He's very aware of the challenges of self-deception. There are always going to be moments when we're honest and realize who we really are. I often think about the imposter syndrome, the idea that, oh my gosh, people are going to realize I don't know what I'm supposed to know. I don't know how to do what I'm supposed to know how to do. And there comes a point in your life, if you're lucky, where you learn to say, I don't know everything. But that doesn't make me an imposter. It makes me a human being. But I think we're so vulnerable and worried about that vulnerability that we put on these masks and armor and makeup. I don't mean necessarily physical makeup, but just the ways that we shield ourselves from people's view of who we really are. And Smith's saying, you're going to be happier if you're more honest and authentic. And of course, that means you should probably behave a certain way because you want to be perceived as honorable and respected and praised. and mattering. And so it's not a bad way to lead your life.
Can you talk to us about the role of what Smith calls the impartial spectator plays into this process? Is it like a conscience? How is it different from God?
Well, it's like conscience. It's a little like God, although Smith is, very eager to point out that people who do the right thing, who act honorably or act altruistically, he says that, they're not necessarily acting because of the way they were raised and the way that the religious motivations that some people have. He argued that we do the right thing most of the time because we want people to respect us. We want people to think highly of us. And you have to be careful. That sounds a little bit like that sounds inauthentic to an extent, right? If you're not careful, you could argue that means, I'll just need to impress other people. It's not what he means. He means that you live your life in a way that you earn respect. And I think that's a good idea in general. But the impartial spectator is a fantastic concept. It's the idea that you're self-interested, and you should be aware that you're self-interested, so that when you're at a point where you're going to make some decision or you have to make a choice, you should be aware that you've got some challenges in assessing the ethics and morality of your decision making, and you might want to remember that how you are viewed by an impartial spectator as opposed to yourself is often going to matter a lot. Now, Smith says we often act as if we were being watched by an impartial spectator. That is, we do try to remember that we have sometimes our own self-interest too much in the forefront of our mind. And so therefore it's good to step back and wonder, well, what if someone here was watching me who wasn't me, who wasn't as loving and accepting of myself? An impartial spectator. I'm very partial to myself. It's one of our powerful human sides. And I think that's a brilliant idea. So he uses it in particular to suggest that people act as if an impartial spectator is watching them. He sometimes calls that the man in the breast, your internal conscience. And I'm being 1759, he said the man, not the person. But I think there's another way to use the idea, which is to be aware of how other people will judge us, and to use that to become a better person, not just to describe or explain how we behave. So, I often think of how we behave when we're alone versus when someone's watching us. If you're with your spouse or your children or your parents, and sometimes you get in a emotional situation and you might raise your voice, you might even yell at your parents or at your children, and you wouldn't do that often if you knew people could hear you. And I think to think about the idea that someone is always watching. And of course, that's one of the religious ideas. It's one of the ideas behind the concept of God, is that someone always is watching. But Smith reminds us that someone who's always watching is yourself. And that out of your own self-respect, it's useful to remember that you want to be lovely. You want to be a person who is worthy of respect and honor and praise. And he argues that that's a good way to help to think of why people do the right thing occasionally. And I'm suggesting that's also a good way to make yourself a better person if you so desire.
Well, it reminds me from when I was younger, it definitely reminds me of Santa, because Santa's always watching, is what people always told me.
He knows if you've been good or bad. So be good, for heaven's sake.
But it also, when I was reading that part of the book, and as you were talking again, I kept thinking of Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, because it so accurately describes why he was behaving the way he was, because he committed a crime no one knew, but he drove himself mad because he first, out of anticipation of knowing that he was going to be found out, and then also I think really that impartial spectator plays a big role in that entire book. So that, for me, because we just had to read it this year for school, so I've just been thinking about that in connection to everything else I do now. But
Sure.
That's what I was thinking about. So This next question is something that's kind of been nagging me since I read the book, which is that you and Smith both seem to agree that following customs and etiquette and not rocking the boat too much, being like nice and generous and stuff, that's important. Yet both of you are radicals in your own way. Smith is a radical because he changed our views about trade and economics. You're a radical in that your classical liberal views are very much in the minority, and you defend those views very passionately and like educate people about stuff like that all over. So what's going on with that?
So that's a great question. I think there's a big difference between behaving properly and what Smith called propriety, which is the same root I suspect is proper. Behaving properly and then the rest of your life, how you behave in a broader, more philosophical sense. Propriety and those norms that you talked about that Smith certainly thought you should comply with, and that I think in general are good to comply with. Those are to allow other people to interact with us in an easy way. So, if you and I we're not doing this face to face, we're doing this over the internet, right? Let's say we met face to face for this interview, and I decided, I'm just kind of tired. I'm not gonna take a shower today. I'm gonna wear a torn shirt, and I'm not gonna trim my beard. And what's the difference? I can do whatever I want, and of course I can. But you have a certain expectation. Or better yet, the world has a certain set of expectations about how you behave in that setting, right? And so when I don't comply with those, and that's a small, really tiny example, right? That tiny example is just you would have a certain expectation of how I would appear, and I don't meet that expectation if in that version of the story. Then the next level would be I talk a lot, I'm rude, I interrupt you all the time, I make bad jokes that you don't think are funny, or worse, that are tasteless or cruel. Well, that's not appropriate. and that doesn't have really anything to do with the content of our conversation. It's just the sort of guidelines and guide rails, right? But within those guidelines, once I comply with the norms that are expected of me, so that I put you at ease. So I dress appropriately. It doesn't mean I have to wear a suit, right? Mm-hmm. But I've trimmed my beard, and my clothes are nice and clean, and I don't smell. I've met the standards, and then I'm polite. I'm not rude. I'm not obnoxious. Well, now what comes out of my mouth, once I've stayed within that basic framework, I have a lot of freedom still, but I'm going to comply with those expectations so that you, as the conversational partner, can have a good experience also. It's not all about me. That's one of Smith's deepest insights. It's not about me. It's about us. It's about our interactions with the people around us, our family, our friends, and strangers. So the metaphor I like to use that I think I stole from Vernon Smith is the idea of a dance floor. Go out on the dance floor, and let's take Victorian England. That dance floor is different than a modern dance floor. There are certain expectations of how you behave. But in most dance floors, whether they were in 1759, 1859, 1959, or 2020, it's not appropriate to step on other people's toes. It's not appropriate to shove people around and bang into them, unless that's different kind of club. But if you're doing most dancing, you're not smashing into other people and knocking them over. And so those are the basic rules. It's like driving on the right side of the road. Driving on the right side of the road in the United States or on the left side of the road in England isn't like an infringement on your freedom. It's a social norm, actually the law, but in general, it wouldn't need it to be the law. It's an expectation that allows people to then drive where they want to go without constantly banging into other people. And similarly, when I go out on a dance floor, proper behavior means I can't just jump around and do all this stuff showing off that I might want to do. I want to take account of the other. If I have a partner I'm dancing with, I want her to look good, for starters. I don't just want to show off me and make her look lousy. And at a minimum, I don't want to bang into other folks. So I think those guardrails, I called them guide rails a minute ago. Those guardrails are what allow us to drive effortlessly on the highway of life. It allows us to, you and I, to have a great conversation as long as I comply with sort of those basic things. But it doesn't rule out, once I've complied with those, I can be as radical as I want, as long as I'm not rude to you, as long as I don't violate your expectations of what would be proper behavior. So, in certain societies, those rules are more onerous than in others, right? Victorian England had, a better example actually would be, there are many movies where the poor person has to go into rich society and doesn't know all the rules, what fork to use and what spoon to use and how to hold the teacup and all that stuff. And we look at that as moderns and go, boy, that stuff's so silly. But we have our own rules. Those are just the rules of fancy society and various times in the past. But we have our own rules about how you dress and how you behave and how you stand and the tone of your voice and how loud you are and how close you get to the person next to you. Right now we're in the middle of a pandemic. I don't like people getting really close to me. I think social distancing right now is probably a good idea. So, most people observe those rules. They don't say, I do whatever I want. In fact, it's a strange thing. I think a lot of people are rebelling against this idea of wearing masks because they think somehow it's an infringement on their freedom. But that's like saying it's an infringement on your freedom that you can't bang into other people when you're on the dance floor. There's certain modest, minimal expectations of how to behave in various situations. It's not a question of necessarily of the government enforcing it at the point of a gun. It's about what's civilized. And Smith, to bring us back to Smith was really interested in understanding where civilization came from. And by civilization, I don't mean the pyramids or some Greek philosophy. By civilization, I mean just the fact we get along. That you can have a civil conversation, a pleasant conversation with a stranger you've never met before, or an encounter in a store with somebody who's selling something and you're the buyer. So all of that has an immense amount of stuff around it that you don't think about because you just comply with those rules and guardrails very naturally. But that's really what Smith's talking about. And once you've done that kind of complying, then you have your freedom of expression of what your content is. Again, you can't necessarily use language that'd be inappropriate in certain settings. Although if you look at America and what's on television or whatever you want to call television these days, video screens, language that was unacceptable 25 years ago is commonplace now in terms of so-called 4-letter words and other things that used to be totally off the unacceptable, and now it's more common. So these evolve, they change, they're not fixed. How people dress is much more casual than it used to be. But once you've done that, once you've complied with what sort of the basic rules are, there's room for self-expression. And in fact, I think those norms and guardrails are what allow the self-expression to work really well, because it means you and I can have that conversation and you're not thinking, boy, why didn't he shower?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes me think about just having respect for other people, having respect for like cultures, for like customs, for, I don't know, just everyone in general, just for other people. And especially with the mask thing, it's out of respect for other people, because wearing a mask or something like that, you're protecting other people from yourself more than you're protecting yourself from other people. But if everyone's wearing a mask, then you're all protecting each other. But that's that.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And it's no fun. Not fun to wear a mask. It's also no fun, by the way. There are a lot of rules in social settings that aren't so fun, right? There's a lot of times I'd rather wear more comfortable clothes than the fancier clothes that I have to put on for certain settings. And we do that because we don't want the people interacting with us to be constantly jarred and to be like, wait, but why? Because once you comply with those things, then it works smoothly, and it allows us to interact in ways that are more productive. And productive, I don't mean like you can make more widgets. I mean more meaningful, more satisfying, more exhilarating. Those are all the things that matter, not what clothes you're wearing. And I think people have a tendency to say, oh, it doesn't matter what clothes I wear. And it does matter. And it does matter how you comport yourself and how you talk. But the content is what really counts. And more than the content, the quality of your interaction with another human being is what's important. And when I meet your expectations, to take a trivial example again, I drive on the right side of the road, and you know that, you expect that, and so you drive on the right side of the road. That allows us both to get somewhere that we want to go. And it's not only an idiot says, "Oh, I can drive on either side. It's a free country." Of course, you are free to do that. You're free to make it dangerous for other people, and that's a bad thing to do. Don't do that.
So, if Smith were resurrected today, what do you think he would find most lovely about people today? And what would he find most troubling about us?
Well, I'm going to do the second part first. I'm not sure what he'd find that's lovely. I think he'd be awed by the human creativity of the modern world. He was just at the cusp of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So, he was interested in how human experience was changing at that time, even though it was just literally a glimmer at that point. I think he would have found this world we live in kind of extraordinary. So that's the part I think he'd like. The part he wouldn't like, I said I'd answer this first, but I guess I'm answering it second. The part he wouldn't, I don't know if he'd dislike it, but I think he'd be somewhat taken aback by social media, because he talks about our urge to overreact to that natural tendency we have to be loved. And I think social media, the pursuit of likes and Twitter followers, and I don't do Instagram. I don't know what the equivalent is there, but we're always looking for that dopamine thrill of, oh, I got another follower, or I'm up over this certain number. And I think that would have alarmed him to some extent, the ability that social media gives us to pursue that kind of celebrity status that, I want to impress the people around us. He understood very deeply that part of us. He also understood very deeply our desire for our love of powerful people, which I mentioned earlier. It's a very natural human response to actually like powerful people. And I think, we see this around the world. We see it throughout history, that not every dictator is unpopular. A lot of people like dictators. They like the idea that someone's in charge, that's taking care of them. They even understand that sometimes they might exploit them, but they still have some respect for how powerful and successful they are. And Smith really writes eloquently about that. I talk a little bit about that in the book. And in his day, he was spared the modern horrors of the totalitarian states of the 20th century. But I don't think they would have surprised him, the lure and seductive appeal of it's typically a man, a strong man, a person who's going to take charge and fix things. And I think that's a very dangerous impulse of human beings. And Smith, I think, thought so too. And I think he would be very unhappy about that, uneasy with it at least.
Before we close, I want to switch gears and talk about podcasting a little bit.
Sure.
You're the founder and host of what I think, at least, is the world's best known economics podcast called Econ Talk. What lessons of being a podcast host have you learned over the years?
So it's been an amazing intellectual journey for me. We talked earlier about the value of learning and just growing intellectually and thinking and philosophy. And I originally started interviewing economists, and now they're a much smaller portion of my guest list. I still interview economists, but I tend to interview philosophers and historians and cultural critics and others. And it's kept me incredibly alive. I love the stimulus I've received from my guests, and I hope that you as a podcast host get to enjoy that as well. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to. I think of it as being able to talk to people smarter than I am and ask them dumb questions and push them and try to get them to explain what they believe and defend it. And it's an incredible gift, and to be able to talk to people every Monday morning in a sense, right? Because I don't get to hear what they say except through comments and email, but the chance to talk to someone else and let other people listen in, which is what a podcast is. When you have a guest and it's not just a monologue, it's just incredibly. It's an amazing thing. And, it's great that other people listen. But if I could, even if no one was listening, the guest wouldn't appear on the program, I guess. But it's just a wonderful chance to learn from other people, and it's broadened my world in an unimaginable way. It's just been a fantastic experience.
Yeah, I'm like starting to feel that more and more. I'm like, even if people didn't listen, I like it so much. I'd just keep doing it.
We're listening.
Okay, so finally, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Probably a few things. Most people don't like to admit they changed their views because I think we don't like to admit that we were wrong. It's particularly true of politicians. They very, very rarely say, "Boy, I messed that up." They always have an excuse, and that's a human thing. I get it. But if I did, there are a few things I've learned. I think probably the most important is the power of economics. I think when I was younger, I thought economics was like science. It was just, the predictions of my way of looking at economics were always right, and I could always justify them. And as I've gotten older, and particularly through Econ Talk, I've realized that the world's probably a little more complicated than that. And that used to really bother me, and I just wouldn't want to think about it. But eventually I got to a point where I kind of enjoyed it. So the most important thing I probably learned from Econ Talk, I alluded to earlier, is to be able to say, I don't know. It's fantastic. It opens up. It's like a huge weight off your chest that you don't have to pretend you know everything, and you don't have to defend every implication of some economic philosophy or model or whatever. And the world's imperfect. Most philosophies are imperfect, and that's okay too. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing, is that when I was younger, I thought economics was like, the predictions were always true of my models, my way of looking at the world, my lens. And now I think, well, they have sent me in the right direction. Most of the time they're right, but they're not always right. And I'm always eager to learn. And, right now, we're in the middle of the pandemic. It's in the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of shortages. And in my view of the world, shortages come from price controls. Because without price controls, you don't get shortages. The price goes up. People who don't like the good so much or don't need the good so much don't buy it. The people who are making the good with the higher price have an incentive to produce more of it. So the gap between what people want and what people produce gets closed, and there aren't any shortages. That was my view of the world, and it's still pretty much my view of the world. But I've been surprised at how many things are hard to get right now. It's hard to get crossword puzzles, evidently. I know it's hard to get bird feeders. For a while, it's hard to get flour. All the things that people like to do when they're stuck at home: watch birds, do jigsaw. I said crossword. I think jigsaw puzzles, bake bread. All those things were short supply. Masks were in short supply for a while. Now that went away very quickly. The non-N95 mask, just the plain kind of mask that average people wear. There's like a zillion of them, and of course they come in all kinds of shapes and colors, and it's fantastic. And that's capitalism at its best. But I'm surprised at how some things didn't bounce back more quickly. And I think that's my worldview tells me to look at prices. Often there's a law that says, oh, if you charge too much higher than you charged before, we're going to take you to court. Those are anti-gouge, price gouging laws, and those did inhibit, I think, some of the production expansion that normally would have happened. But I've started to think, well, maybe there's some cultural norms that are not legal. But why did the makers of toilet paper and the makers of hand sanitizer raise the prices early on and get rid of the shortages? Meaning, it's not just, we'll exploit people, but why weren't there an incentive for new producers to come online and charge more, and for people who didn't need so much hand sanitizer, who were stockpiling it, to stop stockpiling it and let other people get at it? That's what happens when prices go up. Discourages hoarding. It's great. It's fantastic, but it didn't happen so much as I would have predicted. So either there were some laws against prices rising, legislation that kept that from happening, but maybe there's cultural norms that people don't like to raise prices. I'll give you another example. Somebody said the other day they wanted to buy a freezer because they realized that, hey, if there's another pandemic and you're stuck at home and you don't want to go out shopping so much, you'd like to store some freeze stuff. Well, it's hard to find a freezer. People say, I don't know if it's really true, but people say it's hard to find a freezer. If you go to Home Depot or you go to Best Buy or wherever, a lot of the freezers are, quote, out of stock. Well, is that because it's just hard to make them quickly? Or is that, why would they ramp up more production, hire more people, get more investment? They have a chance to make a lot of money right now, but maybe they don't want to raise their price. And so there's a restriction on it, a cultural restriction on how much money they can make. And that discourages them from doing those things they need to create more of the stuff. And if that's true, then I need to rethink some of what I would say is the way the world works in terms of supply and demand. So those are the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I know at the beginning of this pandemic, I was kind of faced with a similar thing. I was like, man, like there are not that many laws like prohibiting any sort of like production of a lot of things. Like no one is stopping the production of flour, but it just wasn't happening. And I didn't think about the cultural aspect of that, but I thought more about the way that it lagged. Like people just didn't realize, like producers didn't think immediately, oh, I'm going to make flour. So I don't know. That's how I was thinking about it.
I think I don't want to push my skepticism too far. I want to make sure you understand that I don't think necessarily my view of the world is wrong, my old view, because I think there are a lot of laws against raising prices, and a lot of attorney generals and the Department of Justice explicitly said that if you raise your price for protective equipment like masks and gowns and ventilators and other things, we'll sue you. So they did kind of, they took the profit out of it, which took away the incentive to ramp up quickly, because ramping up quickly costs money. And if you can't earn it back in the form of a higher price, you're not going to ramp up. So there were restrictions, but there are other things I can't imagine. I think there were some unease on the part of producers to raise their prices, even if it was legal. So like I think that's part of it. What?
Like a freezer.
Like a freezer. There's no reason. I don't think you'd get taken to court for price gouging, but I might be wrong about that. So, maybe my old view is really the root of what's caused some of these shortages, but I think that's what economists ought to be thinking about, by the way, and learning about and studying, and we don't do much of that.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.